Welcome back to Kafka Internals Crashcasts. I'm your host, Sheila, and today we're continuing our deep dive into Kafka producers. We'll be exploring the fascinating world of serializers, partitions, and keys. Joining me as always is our Kafka expert, Victor. Victor, are you ready to unravel these concepts for our listeners?
Absolutely, Sheila. I'm excited to dive into these crucial elements of Kafka producers. They play a significant role in how data is processed and distributed within a Kafka cluster.
Great. Before we start, let's kick things off with a quick quiz for our listeners. Here's the question. In Kafka, if you use the same key for multiple messages, will they always end up in the same partition? Think about it, and we'll reveal the answer at the end of the episode.
That's an intriguing question, Sheila. It touches on the relationship between keys and partitions, which is a fundamental aspect of Kafka's architecture. I'm sure our listeners will find the answer enlightening.
All right, let's start with the basics. Victor, can you explain what serializers are in the context of Kafka producers?
Certainly. In Kafka, serializers are components that convert the data you want to send into a byte array. This is necessary because Kafka stores and transmits data as bytes. Think of serializers as translators that convert your data from its native format, like a Java object, into a language that Kafka understands.
I see. So, if I wanted to send a Java object as a message, I'd need a serializer to convert it to bytes first?
Exactly. Kafka provides some built-in serializers for common data types like strings and integers, but you can also create custom serializers for complex objects.
That makes sense. Now let's move on to partitions. How do they fit into the picture?
Great question. Partitions are the way Kafka divides topics to allow for parallel processing and scalability. You can think of partitions like sorting centers in a postal service. Just as multiple sorting centers can process mail simultaneously, multiple partitions allow Kafka to handle data in parallel.
That's a helpful analogy. So how does Kafka decide which partition a message goes to?
That's where keys come in. When you produce a message to Kafka, you can optionally specify a key. If a key is provided, Kafka uses a hash of the key to determine which partition the message goes to. If no key is provided, Kafka uses a round-robin approach to distribute messages across partitions.
Interesting. You mentioned a hash of the key. Could you briefly explain what that means for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term?
Of course. A hash function is like a formula that takes an input, in this case our key, and produces a fixed-size output. This output is used to determine which partition the message goes to. The important thing is that the same key will always produce the same hash, ensuring consistent partition assignment.
Thanks for clarifying that. Now, are there any best practices or common pitfalls when it comes to using keys?
Absolutely. One best practice is to choose keys that provide a good distribution of messages across partitions. If you use very few distinct keys, you might end up with unbalanced partitions. A common pitfall is changing the number of partitions in a topic without considering how it affects the mapping of keys to partitions.
That's valuable advice. Now, let's dig a little deeper. Can you explain how custom serializers work and when we might need them?
Of course. Custom serializers come into play when you're working with complex data types that the standard serializers can't handle. For example, if you have a custom user object, you might create a user serializer that knows how to convert user objects into byte arrays. This often involves serializing the object's fields in a specific order.
I can see how that would be useful. Are there any performance considerations when using custom serializers?
Good point, Sheila. Custom serializers can impact performance, especially if they're not efficiently implemented. It's important to benchmark your custom serializers and consider using faster serialization frameworks like Apache Avro or protocol buffers for complex objects.
Thanks for that insight, Victor. Now, circling back to partitions, are there any advanced strategies for partition assignment that our listeners should be aware of?
Absolutely. While the default partitioner in Kafka works well for many use cases, you can implement custom partitioners for specific needs. For example, you might want to partition messages based on a specific field in your data rather than the entire key. This can be useful for ensuring related data ends up in the same partition for efficient processing.
That's fascinating. It seems like there's a lot of flexibility in how you can configure producers. Before we wrap up, can you share any memorable anecdotes or interesting facts about serializers, partitions, or keys in Kafka?
Sure, here's an interesting fact. In the early days of Kafka, all partitioning was done on the client side. The current server-side partitioning was introduced to improve performance and reduce network overhead. This change highlights how Kafka has evolved to become more efficient over time.
That's a great piece of Kafka history. Now, let's reveal the answer to our quiz question. Victor, if you use the same key for multiple messages, will they always end up in the same partition?
The answer is, it depends. In general, yes, messages with the same key will go to the same partition. This is because the same key produces the same hash, which determines the partition. However, this is only guaranteed if the number of partitions in the topic doesn't change. If you add partitions to a topic, the mapping of keys to partitions can change.
Thanks for that explanation, Victor. To summarize today's episode, 1. Serializers convert data into byte arrays for Kafka to process. 2. Partitions allow Kafka to process data in parallel, like multiple postal sorting centers. 3. Keys determine which partition a message goes to using a hash function. 4. Custom serializers and partitioners can be used for complex data types and specific partitioning needs. 5. It's important to choose keys that provide good distribution and be cautious when changing the number of partitions. Next time, we'll be discussing error handling and timeouts in Kafka producers. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating if you're enjoying the series. Until next time, keep those Kafka clusters humming.